According to Fox News, the Department of Justice announced criminal charges against 15 defendants in Minnesota today, alleging schemes that targeted more than $90 million in taxpayer funds across state-managed Medicaid programs. This among several other topics that I'm excited to discuss with our friends Hans von Spakovsky now, the Advancing American Freedom Senior Legal Fellow, former FEC Commissioner, and former DOJ lawyer. Hans, welcome back to the show. Another busy news day. We're grateful to have you on.
Yeah, it is. And look, we should point out that $90 million that these 15 people are charged with stealing, what was that money meant for? Kids with autism and finding stable homes for the poor. I mean, these folks were targeting the most vulnerable in our society. And this was at the very same time that another one of the fraudsters who was found guilty of stealing hundreds of millions of dollars, Amy Bach, who had this program called Feeding Our Future, she was stealing child nutrition money. I mean, these are the worst of the worst people. I have to tell you, I hope they are sentenced to the maximum time possible in jail.
Yeah, make an example out of them for the rest of the country to see, to understand we're coming for you and we're not offering any mercy in this regard. One of the things that the assistant AG there said at the beginning is he said, this isn't the end of the investigation. This isn't the end of the beginning of the investigation. This is the beginning of the investigation, which makes me think $90 million, anytime we're talking about millions now, unfortunately, when it comes to fraud and corruption, that seems like, it's just an M million, that there's a lot more out there to get. He acts as though this is just the very, very beginning.
Well, yeah, look, it's clear from other investigative reports, particularly by reporters, conservative reporters, that there are a lot more front organizations there, basically fake companies that were set up for all kinds of things like home health care, who were obviously stealing money. And of course, the biggest problem for taxpayers is we will probably never get even a fraction of this money back. I mean, the most we'll get out of this, hopefully, is finding the people who stole this money and put them in prison. But recovering the literally hundreds of millions of dollars were stolen, unfortunately, that's probably not going to happen.
But, Hans, also with that, it is important to stop the bleeding at this point in time and keep it from happening in the future.
Right. And keep in mind, look, this is going on in Minnesota, but we now have reports this was happening in Ohio. There are reports this was happening in Los Angeles. And so this is, as they said, this may just be the beginning of the beginning in Minnesota. It's only the beginning of this in many parts of the country. Yeah.
Well, I'm happy to hear this. Before we move on to the next topic, Hans, I'm curious of your thoughts of this is a special, this administration kind of has a special focus on fraud. They've put JD Vance in charge of it. As I read on the screen when they were doing the report, he's the Assistant Attorney General for Fraud Enforcement. Is this a special group specifically for this moment in time, or is this a department at the Department of Justice that has existed and maybe just been taking a nap or something?
Well, I think they were taking a nap. And yeah, this is a special group that's been enhanced inside DOJ to do something about this. Look, the problem with past DOJs was frankly the same problem we saw in Minnesota. These were Medicaid programs. A lot of the theft was unfortunately concentrated in the Somalian community, and the politically correct woke prosecutors that inhabited the DOJ, particularly during the Biden administration, probably were reluctant to go after these folks. Same way the Minnesota government, as we know, including the governor, didn't want an investigation into this.
Yeah, I wonder why. I continue to desire more reports and news and discovery on these issues. And I can't wait for them to reach out into the rest of the country where we start to see more charges, indictments for these 15 individuals, get it all across the country. I want to shift to yesterday's news regarding Raúl Castro. I think that this is something, there's a division of people, I think, in our country who understand a little bit more about Cuba, about Cuban history. There are a lot of Cuban Americans who were very, very excited yesterday to hear that the Department of Justice issued this indictment against Raúl Castro. Talk to me about who Castro is, and then we can get into why the Department of Justice got involved.
Well, as you know, he's one of the worst of the entire Castro family. This was a long time coming, but for those who object to this or critical of it, keep in mind that this was not something new. If you look carefully at the indictment from the Justice Department, this is not something new. It's a superseding indictment. Why is that? Because this whole case was entirely investigated during the Clinton administration 30 years ago, when two Cuban MiG fighters shot down two American civilian planes in international airspace. It was brothers to the rescue. They used to patrol the straits between Cuba and Miami looking for Cubans who were fleeing the communist government there. 4 individuals were indicted back in '96, the 2 MiG pilots, the head of the Cuban Air Force, and a Cuban spy who was in Miami who had infiltrated Brothers to the Rescue and had provided the intelligence needed for the MiG fighters to shoot down these planes. The only one who ever went to prison was the spy. It was also clear that Raúl Castro, he was the defense minister at the time. He clearly had given the orders, and there was enough investigation evidence to indict him back then. Why didn't they do it? Because the Clinton administration was trying to increase diplomatic or improve diplomatic relations with Cuba and didn't want to do it. So this is not new evidence. They're just finally doing what should have been done 30 years ago to indict Raúl Castro for the murder of 4 Americans.
It's interesting to see some of these things. It feels to me like President Trump, in his 4-year purgatory between term 1 and term 2, started making a list of wrongs and said, can we write this one? I think we can. Can we write this one? I think we can do that too. And just went over and over and over again and pulling these things out that, obviously struck a chord with a lot of Cuban Americans, a lot of people who understand the details of the history of what you're talking about, that these things still do matter. And, is it a good use of the Department of Justice's time to go into this and bring this back up in May of 2026?
Oh, I agree that is exactly what they should have done. And it's a good thing. No one should be allowed to get away with these kind of terrible crimes. And by the way, again, something I don't think people noticed, but in the DOJ story, and I think this might have been what brought this back up, is it turns out that one of the military pilots who was involved in this, who never actually ended up in a courtroom, apparently he's in the United States. And last November, he was in the U.S. He applied for permanent residency. And they discovered who he was, and they indicted him for lying on his immigration form because he claimed he'd never been part of the military. So we actually have one of the other people in the United States who was involved in this.
It's outrageous. And I'm thinking, too, you're talking about how this goes back to the Clinton administration. I have this recollection at the end of President Obama's presidency where all of a sudden it kind of felt like it was out of nowhere, but it's never out of nowhere. It was like, let's normalize Cuba. Let's make Cuba look good. And President Obama, I think there was a baseball game involved, and President Obama went to Cuba and was just kind of hobnobbing like, hey, it's a nice place here. Nothing to see. Is that odd that President Obama in 2016 was engaging in that type of activity as the president of the United States when all of this was sitting on someone's desk somewhere?
Oh, I think it's a sign of his, frankly, abject immorality and the love that the left, from Barack Obama to Hollywood personalities, have had for Fidel Castro and all the members of his family, and have made excuses for decades for the horrible way they have arrested, tortured, killed the people of of Cuba. Because why? Because they like socialism. They like the kind of communist dictatorship that was put in Castro. I don't understand how they could have those kind of feelings, but they've demonstrated it on numerous occasions.
Yeah, it's bizarre, but strange bedfellows for sure. Before we let you go, we're speaking with Hans von Spakovsky, Advancing American Freedom's Senior Legal Fellow, also former FEC Commissioner and DOJ lawyer. Hans, I want to talk to you a little bit because my understanding is you have some knowledge on what's going on in my home state of Illinois. For people who remember when Colbert invited Governor J.B. Pritzker onto a show and they pointed, Colbert slaps that map of the districts up on his desk, starts to make a joke about it, points out one and says, that looks like a scorpion. Well, that Hans, that's my district. That 13th district that snakes through the state, that's where I live. My understanding is Jeannie Ives, who I know and have a friendship with, is the person who is filing this lawsuit to say, maybe in the wake of Callais, among other things, that these districts are unconstitutional. What can you tell us about this lawsuit and what kind of future it might have?
Well, Illinois, the actions of the legislature, the governor, and in fact, state law make it very clear that race is supposed to be taken into account when drawing up districts. Well, the Louisiana versus Callais decision confirmed you cannot do that. That is a violation of the 14th and 15th Amendments. You cannot discriminate on the basis of race. So the lawsuit that was filed actually attacks that statute. That is a state statute that specifies that you can and must discriminate on the basis of race. And what the lawsuit does is say that statute is void under the U.S. Constitution and needs to be knocked out. And if that happens, then it'll be up to the legislature to draw up new districts that are not racially discriminatory.
Do you think that this lawsuit will have the legs it needs to make a difference in Illinois?
Oh, I think it will if the judges involved actually follow what the Supreme Court has said in the Louisiana case. That the lower court judges, they tend to be more liberal. They might not want to follow it, but I can tell you that if this ever got to the courts of appeal and or to the Supreme Court, they would, I think, quickly agree that Illinois statute is unconstitutional under the U.S. Constitution.
Well, Hans, you're a gem to have here on the show with us each week. We're thankful for your connection here to this particular case, but we look forward to following up with you soon on it. Hans von Spakovsky, thanks. It's always good to talk to you.
Sure. Thanks for having me.
Take care. Have a great Memorial Day weekend. Hans von Spakovsky, Advancing American Freedom, Senior Legal Fellow, former FEC Commissioner, and former DOJ lawyer. Follow on H. von Spakovsky on the old X.